Well, it's 7 o'clock. So hello and welcome everyone to our next webinar, the International Mountain section of the Society for Range Management Spring Webinar Series of 2023. This is the fourth webinar in the series. We've had a pretty good set of webinars so far, and we have a couple more coming up. Our next webinar is Friday, April 14th at noon. That will be featuring research from the University of Alberta. If you've missed any of our previous webinars or want to go back and watch them and listen to them, you can find more information on our website. That is ims.rangelands.org. There'll be links there. We've got our videos up on YouTube. So if you want more information, go there. This one will be recorded and will be posted there in the next few days as well. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping things for the webinar. We will be recording this webinar so that we can post it so you can go back and watch it. So when you come in, you probably saw a thing that said this will be recorded. You just had to hit OK. Please do keep yourself muted throughout the webinar. This is run more as a Zoom meeting than it is a webinar. And so try to keep an eye on your microphone, whether you're muted or not. And I'll go ahead and mute people that are making a little bit of noise. Please save your questions till the end of the webinar. We'll have 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the hour for questions. If you want to ask a question, you can go ahead and type your question in the chat box, and at the end, Lisa can answer your questions. Or if you want to raise your hand, and Lisa will ask you, and you can unmute yourself and ask your question then. So, introducing our speaker this evening, we have Dr. Lisa Rue. She is a professor of invasive plant ecology in the Department of Land Resources and Environmental Science at Montana State University. She has a very interesting background. She was raised in southwestern Britain on a farm. She completed her schooling in Great Britain, but she's worked in Britain, she's worked in Australia, and now she's working in Montana. So she has done a lot of things, and she's done a lot of work at Red Bluff too. And so that's what we're going to hear about today. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Lisa.
Okay, thanks, Noah. I guess, would it be all right if we could get everybody to unmute for a minute? Because it would be interesting to me to know where people are from and what they do, so that I can try and make the presentation a little bit more tailored. Is that acceptable?
Yeah, I think we definitely can. I guess I can start. I'm Noah Davis. I am the foreman at Montana State University's Red Bluff Ranch, and so I have some experience with some of the stuff Lisa will be talking about.
Natasha Renas here from Alberta. I am the lead on the terrestrial invasive species program with the government of Alberta, so this will be right up my alley.
Jill Allen, Jefferson County weed coordinator, noxious weed coordinator over in Whitehall and Boulder area.
Hey, this is Stuart Jennings from Bozeman, Montana, so I'm not too far from home. Nice to see you, Lisa.
Hi, Stuart.
Good evening. My name is Katie Decker. I'm calling from Hilger, Montana. I serve as a supervisory rangeland management specialist with the Bureau of Land Management in the Lewistown Field Office. I oversee the integrated weed management program for BLM.
Keith here from Northeast BC. We don't have any annual grasses except for a bit of annual bluegrass, but I'm scared they might be on their way.
Okay.
Hi there, I'm Lisa Rotz. I work at the Rangeland Research Institute at the University of Alberta, and so Noah and I are sort of coordinating our groups presenting for these webinar series, but we are running a trial in southern Alberta looking at indaziflam on annual brome.
Anybody else want to be brave and introduce themselves?
Sure. My name's Tony Blake. I'm a vegetation manager working out of Lacombe, Alberta, and an amateur botanist.
All right, well, thanks to everybody that did introduce themselves. It's helpful, you know, to know roughly who you're talking about or who you're talking to, especially as when everybody hasn't got a picture. It's kind of weird just standing in a room talking. As Noah said, yeah, I'm originally from the UK, worked in Australia, and now I'm here. I have been here for 22 years, even though it doesn't sound like it. And the work that I'm going to be talking about is about invasive grasses, but particularly cheatgrass, because that's the main problem, particularly at Red Bluff. And basically, this group of people we have, Jane Mangold, she's extension. Tim Seipel is also extension, but he was previously a PhD student. He's crop extension. Eric Lenhoff and Christian Larson. We've all been working at Red Bluff since about 2012, I realized, when I started putting this together. And so I realized we've had 5 different projects out there, and they do actually sort of link together. So I'm going to try and go through them, not quite in chronology, but in hopefully a way that will make a little bit of sense. So the outline is what, where, and why cheatgrass is a problem. And this started back in 2012 with, will there be more cheatgrass in Montana? And I think this hopefully will help everybody from Alberta, because here we're always worried about, is cheatgrass going to behave in Montana like it behaves in the Great Basin? And everybody's always worried about that. And so the questions we were asking initially were, will there be more cheatgrass after fire? Because in the Great Basin, there's that positive fire feedback. You know, so cheatgrass germinates in the fall, it grows before a lot of the natives start. If there's fire, it's dried off when the fire starts. And so it burns more rapidly, and it has already produced seeds before the natives have. So there's this idea that there's this positive fire feedback, and people are worried about, would that happen in Montana? And then how much does it increase after disturbance, whether disturbance is putting in a fire break, or more soil disturbance, whether it be from cattle or, you know, driving over it, things like that. And then how is that going to change as our climate continues to alter, getting warmer and drier? So those are the projects that we did sort of to begin with, and then some of them overlapped with how can we best control it. And there was a lot of interest in biocontrol approaches, so we looked at those, herbicides, but then, and targeted grazing is popular, but then can we combine that? Can we use herbicides with targeted grazing to make things improve things? And then more recently, we've been looking at soil amendments, and they work over a longer time. So we've been comparing that with indaziflam to see how we can use those to actually control cheatgrass. So that's the plan, and we'll see how we go. And I know Noah said questions at the end, but I guess if something really doesn't make sense, raise your hand and I'll try and see it over in the box, and then we can address that as we go along. Okay, so I think most of you are aware of this. You know what cheatgrass is. I'm going to call it cheatgrass rather than downy brome. And it was first introduced into the Western United States in the late 19th century. And as you're aware, it's palatable, particularly early in the season, and quite a lot of managers and ranchers that I speak to around here do early grazing or late fall grazing just to actually use that forage. But as I said, now there's this interest in, can you be more targeted in order to get rid of it? And here in Montana, it's a regulated plant. I'm afraid I didn't remember to look up whether it is in Alberta too, and British Columbia. So as you're probably aware, it's invaded all different types of habitats. But I'm really only going to be concentrating on rangelands today. My mouse is too sensitive. Okay. So this spot here is not quite, but is roughly Red Bluff. So I've tried to cover here British Columbia and Alberta, Montana. So just to highlight, we've got these forested areas, and then we've got these different areas here in terms of the Great Basin, but obviously we've got a lot of grasslands through this area too. So these are two shots of Red Bluff, for those that haven't been there. Apparently I only seem to take photos in the spring and in the fall, but anyway, it's a very pleasant place, and we always work on the north side, which has had a history of light grazing. And as I said at the beginning, our interest from this is sort of, our interest in this has come from the sagebrush biome, in terms of everybody being worried that cheatgrass is going to take over, and it's going to behave the same here with our little spot. This is Red Bluff again. But in Montana as a whole, the same as it's behaving down here in the Snake River Plain and the Great Basin. I have done some work with Tim Prather, who's over in Idaho. So he's over more in this area here. And we did look at some of the data in terms of the impact of cheatgrass. So on this, I should do this, that would be better. In this image here, we've got cheatgrass cover on this axis, the x-axis here. So from 0 to 80, and then we've got native species richness. So as the amount of cheatgrass increases, the amount of native species go down. So we've got these negative responses. And that's whether we're on the east or the west side of the dividing range. This is the west side of the dividing range, and this is the east side of the dividing range. And then if we look at diversity, so that's the relative abundance of different species. And we think about, if we want a better system, the species are going to be more evenly distributed, rather than we have a much lower diversity here if we've got a lot of cheatgrass. So that's a situation that you don't want. So this information does tell us that cheatgrass is negatively impacting our environment, both here and west of the divide. But our populations of cheatgrass, as you can see, are generally a lot lower. So, you know, there's a lot in the sort of just over 0 through to sort of 30%. And according to all the work that's been done, that's ideal for when we can actually control it. So here we're in a really good situation. We don't want cheatgrass, but we have it, but it's at low enough levels that we should be able to control it. If it gets as bad as it is in the Great Basin, and they have means that are much more similar to the 20 to 60% or higher, when it's that dense, then it's really difficult to control it. And if you control it, to push it back to something that you'd like more. Okay, so when I think about trying to improve things, I'm thinking about ecosystem structure. So by this, I mean, what does the rangeland look like in terms of how many annuals do we have? What's the amount of perennial grasses versus forbs and shrubs. And then in terms of ecosystem function, how much forage is being produced, and how well is it reducing soil erosions and things like that. So if you have a mine site, it might be really disturbed, so it's got really low function and structure. But areas that haven't been invaded by an invasive species are up here. So when we're doing management, we want to move from a lower level to a higher level. And as I was saying here, we've reduced our systems, but not as badly as they have further south. So we're in a situation where we should be able to improve. Okay. I'm going to skip through that. So we do know that the temperature's changing, and this diagram is basically just showing if Red Bluff is here. So BC and Western Alberta all through Montana and further down has been getting a lot warmer over these 3 decades. There has been some cooling if we're going into Saskatchewan and into the Dakotas. So it is warming, or it has warmed, and it's continued to warm. But for us, the rainfall amount hasn't actually changed. The amount of precipitation has remained fairly similar. But there is concern that if we do get hotter, are we going to have problems like they have further south? Okay, so study number 1. The question was, how does cheatgrass respond to fire and disturbance? And then, does wildfire and management alter the plant community in Montana? Does the plant community return to pre-fire conditions? So the reason why we did this was because there was a wildfire at Red Bluff in 2012. Somebody had a firework that went awry, and basically the fire burnt up from the Madison all the way up through the hills here. You can hopefully see this is much greener, different color. And then they put in a fire break, which is this line here. So that was a bulldozer line, and it's about, I was going to say, I think it's about 15 feet wide. And then this area here was not burnt. And then the BLM, very close by up at Preacher Creek, basically did some prescribed burning. So here you can see the road. They didn't put in a fire break, but basically we have a road. One side of the road they did prescribed burn, and the other side they didn't. So what we wanted to see was, how does cheatgrass respond? You know, everybody's worried after fire it's really going to increase in this burned area. So we were able to look at it for 3 years to see how does it change in the burned area versus the unburned, and then the same here. Okay, so this is just a closer up view. You can hopefully again see this fire break. And we sampled along the fire break in the burned area and in the unburned area. And we did that numerous times. Okay, so the results from this. So this is the amount of bare ground. Sorry, my mouse is too sensitive. Bare ground in the unburned area, there was bare ground 20% in 2013. It went down but didn't change significantly in 2014 and 15. In the burned area, makes sense, it's burned, you've got a lot of bare ground, and it's decreasing significantly over those 3 years. And in that fire break, huge amounts of bare ground the first year, 70%, dropping to just over 20% the second year, and then pretty similar the third. So something's growing, right, in this bare ground. The question is what? So here is what I've just talked about. And then on this one, this is cheatgrass. So in the unburned area, cheatgrass is present. It's not significantly different, although it looks like it's increasing a little bit over the 3 years. In the burned area, didn't differ the first 2 years, but it did increase a bit in the third year. And then in the fire break, it was high and it kept on increasing. Native grasses, or the forage that we would be interested in, very similar in the unburned and the burned area in all 3 years. And whilst it was increasing here by the 3rd year, it was still a lot lower than everywhere else. And the native forb cover didn't differ. So as a result of this one, and I'm showing you the results from Red Bluff here, we found similar responses at the prescribed fire area in terms of there was a response, there was more bare ground, there was slightly more cheatgrass, but by the 3rd year it didn't differ from the unburned area. But what really worried us was this fire break in the 3rd year. So I actually went back in 21 when I was training some undergraduates in the summer. And what you can see here is if we do the green, that's the unburnt in the 3 years I've just showed you. And then it stayed pretty the same all the way up to 21. In the burnt area, as I showed you, it was higher, but it's come back down to be the same as the unburnt area. But the worrying thing is that the bulldozed area has remained really high. And actually, we've just got some funding to go back now, which will be 10 years later, and resample these plots and check that, you know, what is really happening here. And then we're going to work with NOAA to decide how we're going to move forward in the bulldozed area if it still is really high, and what the plan should be. So hopefully we can use some of the management options I'm going to show you on this fire break this coming fall. Okay, so then study 2, which was happening concurrently, was how does cheatgrass respond to prescribed fire and climate change? And this was an experiment. It's just a little bit further up the hill than the fire break that I've just showed you. And in this area, we had lots of little chambers that we we have these chambers. They're about 1.25 meters or 3.5 feet across diameter. And they increase the temperature by just about 2 degrees, about 1.5 to 2 degrees C. So this is the hotter, and then we also put these shelters over them. So this means that about 60% of the rainfall is actually prevented from touching the ground. So this is hotter and drier. And then we did a prescribed burn on the plot. So we had mixtures of all of these. And what we wanted to know is in our environment, if we get hotter and hotter and drier, and then we add fire, are we going to really see an increase in the amount of cheatgrass? Okay, results. So I know there's a lot going on in this slide, but I always get worried when I say but cheatgrass may not be such an issue in our environment, is what this study said. And we did that same experiment that I just showed you over 3 continuous years. So it wasn't just 1 year of data. But what you can see here is Bromus tectorum cover. So going from 0 to 1's up at 60%, increasing native grass cover. This is the ambient here. So same result as before. As you increase the amount of native grass cover, the amount of cheatgrass you find decreases. That's this line. And from the Great Basin, you would expect if you add heat and then fire, you're going to get an increase. But we found a decrease in terms of cover, seed production, and density, whether we were looking at warming, which is this dashed line, or warming and drying, which is the long dashes. So in our case, warming up and warming in, drying it decreased cheatgrass cover, which is good. And I think it's important to mention that this is, I think, a lot driven by the fact that further south, their winters aren't so cold. They have less snow cover. So cheatgrass, when it emerges in the fall, it merges and then there's a period when it's dormant, but the snow goes away earlier than it does here. And so then cheatgrass can use that moisture in, late January, February, March, April, and get ahead of all of the native grasses. But what we see in our area still is we're still having really cold temperatures. So the cheatgrass isn't growing in February and March and April, or if it is, it's only growing a little bit. And then when the snow goes away and the temperatures have warmed up, the native grasses are growing as well. So unless we get a real change in the pattern of our precipitation, and so we get much warmer springs and the snow's melting, that's what it's going to take in order for cheatgrass to have an advantage, a real advantage here, like it does further south. At the moment, it seems like it's just going to be a problem where we are. Okay, so then when we did do the simulated fire, what we did find was that individual cheatgrass did actually produce more seeds. So this is the solid line. So if we burn it, cheatgrass is producing more seeds. If there's no native cover, it's producing about 13 seeds per plant versus more like 8 if there isn't any native grass. So more seed, but not by much. Okay, so summary from these two studies. Fire results in an initial shift in the plant communities, but that burned area, both prescribed and wildfire, returned to be very similar to the unburned in just 3 years. In our case, we weren't seeing, when we had fire, we had a huge bloom of cheatgrass, except for where we had the fire break. And that led to really high domination of cheatgrass. And as I said, we're going to look at it this year, but it doesn't look like the native vegetation has been able to come back there. So that's a big problem. Warming and drying didn't actually do anything positive for cheatgrass in our study, which is good news. But I do want to put in this caveat that if we have much hotter, drier summers without huge storms coming through and the winter temperature really increases, that could actually start to promote cheatgrass, but we're not seeing it at the moment. Okay, so on to management. So this is actually a picture in the Centennial Valley, and I'm showing it because it's a study that we've done, and this blonde area, square area you can see here, is where we put down a tarp before we sprayed. And so this was what the area looked like. It was full of cheatgrass before we actually sprayed it. So I'm just giving a plug for leaving some spots unsprayed so you can actually look to see how much improvement you've got. So I guess I'm not allowed to ask this, but basically what I was going to go through is who was currently managing cheatgrass and whether you're using herbicide, targeted intensive grazing, doing any reseeding, integrated weed management, biocontrol, or seed amendments. Instead, I'll just continue on with talking about what we've been doing. So the third study, this was actually more led by Jane, and it was through the interest of, can we use biological control to reduce cheatgrass? So this is actually a picture of black fingers of death on cheatgrass. So she looked at Red Bluff at 3 different naturally occurring pathogens. Head smut, black fingers of death, and the one that you've probably heard of more is Pseudomonas fluorescens, which is a bacteria, and it's meant to reduce seedling vigor. And there was a lot of interest in this a decade ago. There's still interest now. There's a lot of people that are still pushing Pseudomonas. but because it's meant to reduce the vigor of the seedlings. But we did the study out at Red Bluff, and this is basically what we would be looking at. We applied, I'm just showing you here the Pseudomonas in 2014, and what we would like to see, this is the control and the Pseudomonas. What we would hope was in the control, the cheatgrass would stay the same, but then where we put this bacteria on, it would decrease. That was what you would want. So what we found was no response whatsoever. And this top left is Red Bluff. So the black is the bacteria and the white is the control. So no difference over 4 years at Red Bluff. The same at the MPG Ranch, which is just outside Missoula, and then 2 other sites in Missoula. So not a successful approach for our area. And one of the potential reasons is where this bacteria was found has a milder winter and it reproduces in January, February, and the temperatures that we have aren't suitable for that. So this was really popular for a while. A lot of people did a lot of work on it. And I'm afraid to say we have had no success with it here or any sites, going up into Canada. Okay, so chemical control alone. I'm guessing that you all know this, but obviously there's different herbicides that we can use. We have the non-selective ones, glyphosate, and I put indaziflam, which I have spelt incorrectly, or Rejuvra here as another non-selective. So that's obviously a new one. And then more selective ones here in terms of imazapic, rimsulfuron. The one that we have used a lot is imazapic, and we're starting to look at indaziflam a little bit more. So I just want to reiterate some work that Jane did. She looked at data from 24 trials all over Montana, many of which she had actually done herself, looking at different rates of imazapic, but basically found that a rate of 6 ounces per acre was the best. And then you should really put it on early post. You have much better control here, more like 80% control if it's early post, and by that mean the 2 to 3 leaf stage rather than anything any taller. And I know that's difficult in terms of timing, but that's the best time to put it on. And this is the study down in the Centennial Valley that I mentioned, and I know there's a lot going on here. But basically, we sprayed in 2018 fall, and again 17 and 18. And then so this is the sprayed areas. And then this is, no, I beg your pardon. We sprayed in 2018 and then 2019. So 2 applications. So in the sprayed area, you can see we've had really low levels in the 2 regions for 3 years. And in the 4th year in this one region, it's come up a little bit, up to a mean of about 10% cover. But in this other region, we had really good control for 4 years. And then those tarp areas here that I'm talking about, this basically showed if it's unsprayed that it's remained high in those areas. So it's really good for imazapic to get 3 to 4 years of control. But we managed it there because we sprayed really late in the fall when it was actively growing and in a 2 to 3 leaf stage. So that was very good control. And if you do it, then you don't have any damage to any other grass species. So that's key. So thinking about how to spray and control cheatgrass, this led to our fourth study. And in this case, we wanted to look at different control measures like the herbicides I've just been talking about and integrate it with targeted grazing. And in this case, targeted grazing, we use the sheep at Red Bluff, and we put them into our areas for just under about a 24-hour period. So in the early spring for 2 consecutive seasons, the sheep did a really good job of totally reducing the amount of forage. I should add this picture here is behind isn't actually Red Bluff. So a little bit complicated maybe, but we had this ungrazed where we used control for glyphosate, for limazepik, for remsulfuron, spring glyphosate, or glyphosate for limazepik. So when we did this study, that was what options that were being suggested. And then we had some grazed options, so just grazing it in the spring for application of glyphosate, grazing in the spring for limazepik, or grazing with fall remsulfuron. So we studied these for 2 years, and this is the result after 2 years. Nothing absolutely wonderful, but cheatgrass cover after a couple of years was reduced where we had grazing and fall limazepik, or grazing and fall remsulfuron. And in those areas, we did have an increase of the other grasses. So that was a fairly good response. Over here, where it was ungrazed, we had spring glyphosate and fall limazepik. After 2 years, there's a better reduction in the amount of cheatgrass cover, but we had no response from the rest of the vegetation. So we switched cheatgrass for bare ground. So this was rather disappointing because there was no real, this is what you should do as a result of this. Although, as I said, grazing and then imazepik seemed to be a pretty good option. We are going back a decade on and looking at these plots again this summer to see what we can see, because you can still see some of the treatments. So we're going to work out if any of them have allowed the native grasses to come back and the desired grasses to come back and kept cheatgrass reduced. Okay, then so the fifth study that I want to talk about, so this is using soil amendments and Reduvra, so that's imazepik, to control cheatgrass and help improve other species. And we have 2 sites, one's near Livingston and one is again at Red Bluff. So in this case, we have controls, we did nothing. We have 3 different rates of the soil amendment, Nutrifix or Redafix. So there's a variety of different micronutrients in Redafix with a slightly higher amount of boron than many of the other micronutrients. And we put it on at the recommended rate, which is highlighted in bold, the medium, but we bracketed it and put it on at the higher and lower dose rate. And the soil amendment is works over a longer time period. So you don't expect to see the full response in the first year. You see more response in the second and third. So when we did our other integrated herbicide grazing and herbicide study, it was before imazepik was around. So in this, indaziflam was around. So in this case, we decided to use indaziflam because it as well works over a longer time period, and you get control in the first year, but more in the second and third, depending on your timing. And I'm really interested in it, and I'm very worried by it, I guess, because anywhere that does have, because it's non-selective, so any seedlings that are going to emerge in the top inch of the soil are not going to be able to for the first 3 years. And we don't really know very much about a lot of seeds in our system in terms of how long do they actually last in the seed bank. And if you have 2 or 3 years of them trying to germinate but being killed off by indaziflam, yes, you may get rid of your cheatgrass, your ventinada, or whatever you're targeting, but it's also possible that you've got rid of other things that you would like to be taking their place. The exception is if you use it selectively in areas like the images I've shown here, where we do have other grasses that we want that are already established and their root zone is lower, so they can keep growing. So anyway, we are evaluating 3 levels of Idafix and indaziflam at the rate that's meant to be used. And I'm going to show you the second year of results. And at the first site in Livingston, cheatgrass cover is here. This is the control, so we did nothing, about 35% cover of cheatgrass. The low and the medium levels of the soil amendment have decreased cheatgrass, but not significantly, statistically that is. But we did find it significantly reduced down here with the high level of soil amendment. And the response of the herbicide was highly variable, as you could see here. But for us in the second year, it did not reduce the amount of cheatgrass significantly. At Red Bluff, all of the treatments in the first and second year significantly reduced the amount of cheatgrass, so that's excellent. The next part of the question is obviously, do we get everything else back that we want? And here we have native grass cover. So these are the controls again at Livingston and at Red Bluff. And as you can see, there's a trend, particularly with the higher level of the amendment here and the rejuva in this site, that we're getting more native grasses, but from a statistical perspective, they didn't differ from the control. But I guess I would say the good news is that they didn't actually decrease, and we will be looking at those again this year. Okay, so I'm about to stop talking. Take-home messages. It's easier to say than do, but prevention is better than any cures. So I guess what I hope that I've shown is we're still learning about annual grasses, cheatgrass included. But once you've got really high densities of it, it's quite hard to get it back to something that you do want. So this is stolen from Jane. Take very good care of your good plants and don't do too much disturbance. So with the fire, they felt they had to put in the fire break. It actually did burn up to the fire break, but it may have petered out before it got to the top of the hill anyway. And that fire break is now a linear feature that looks like it's full of cheatgrass, which can then reinfect, you know, both the burned and the unburned area, which we're going to look at. Same with too much driving or too much grazing. Any of those things that cause bare ground and too much disturbance could increase the amount of nutrients available, are going to give weedy plants like cheatgrass opportunity to increase. But my other point is there's no easy solution. We do still have low levels of cheatgrass, but it's the right time for us to try and control them when they're at this level. And we don't want to get like further south when they've got 60, 80, 100% cheatgrass. And I know this is difficult because the window of opportunity is small. So what I mean by that is, if we're thinking of a mazopic or targeted grazing for cheatgrass, any of those things, our climate is such that we don't get any rain in the fall or precipitation in the fall, then we get some and the plants start to emerge. But the time between there and when the snow falls and it stays is very narrow. But getting applying at the right time within that window is really important. In some cases, if you miss it, it's not worth doing it until the following year. And I do think these integrated approaches and more adaptive approaches are the way to go. There isn't going to be just one way to deal with it. It's going to depend on each site and what's happening. But hopefully I've given some ideas, and that would be helpful. And I guess now we can have questions. Thank you all for listening. Okay, Lisa told me that cheatgrass and Japanese brome are noxious weeds up in Alberta.
Yeah, that's right, Lisa. And I had a question for you as well, because we're in southern Alberta, we're running some trials and we're really close to the Montana border. And what we found is a lot of what we're seeing isn't actually cheatgrass or Bromus tectorum, it's other invasive bromes. And I was just wondering whether you're also seeing more of a brome complex where you are, or is it mostly just Bromus tectorum?
That's a good question. And actually around us, it is actually mainly Bromus tectorum. If you go further east, it switches over to be more Japanese brome. It seems like here we have areas where you have both of them, but it's where you've had a dry fall and you get a wet spring, you see more Japanese brome. If you get more precipitation in the fall, you see more cheatgrass. We have done studies further east in Montana where it is more Japanese brome. And I mean, Amazopic works as well, but we haven't worked with Indaziflam there.
Right. Yeah, and we're looking at Indaziflam on what looks like Japanese brome, but we've actually think it's something called corn brome or Bromus sclerosis is what we're seeing most of.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I haven't seen that here.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
Barry, looks like you raised your hand. You can go ahead.
Yeah, we were on a tour once over in Oregon, and they had a nasty little species called ventinata. Have you seen that? Because it outcompetes cheatgrass and all those other nasty ones so far, and it seems like one that should be on the radar everywhere.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and I was we are seeing it, and it's now in 24 Montana counties, but I think we're going to find it more because I think we've actually started learning what it looks like. So I think we've had it for a little while. I think that a lot of us just walk through places and go, oh, it's peculiar looking cheatgrass or Japanese brome, but it's actually ventinata. I haven't seen any ventinata at Red Bluff, but we are working on ventinata in other parts of the Gallatin County. And actually, we've got one site near Shodo. We've got another couple sites up around Thompson Falls, looking at different herbicides and also the soil amendment on ventinata. So I think it is worrying, and it's strange because it's such a small, wiry, weedy looking grass. We don't really understand, like in Oregon, where it does seem, in Idaho, where it is outcompeting cheatgrass. It's not because it produces a lot of leaves. It's not because it produces a lot of roots. They think this could be because it has a sort of a bacterial association. So we're still trying to work out how is it invading, but it's certainly much worse than cheatgrass because the amount of silicon in ventinata leaves is about 16% versus cheatgrass and Japanese brome and the other grasses that we might want for forage are about 10%. And then in terms of crude protein, it's really low crude protein, and the bromes are in the middle, and then the normal forage grasses are much higher. So I think it's a problem as well when it comes in, because it doesn't break down because it's got these high levels of silica in it. So it's a problem you can't graze it, and it doesn't break down very quickly. So it's something we don't want for sure. I guess I should ask, do you have it at your place?
Well, I haven't seen it personally, but I'm not so sure that many people in Alberta would know what it was either. So it's yeah, I haven't heard of it up here, but that doesn't mean it's not here.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of where we found it in the northern parts of Montana, because it's come in from the Idaho panhandle, and so it's in that stretch, but it hasn't yet been found. I mean, it may be there, but maybe we haven't found it in all of the other counties that are, bordering you. It likes it a bit wetter, so hence doing slightly better in Idaho. So I don't know how wet you are, but it doesn't seem to like particularly wet sites. I hope
Generally, I would say wetter than Montana, or the rangeland area of Montana. But
right. Well, if you see something that's got very thin leaves and you think that looks like a strange cheatgrass, then send it somewhere for somebody to identify it. Any other questions?
Go ahead, Barry. I think we've got a small enough group. If anyone has a question, you can just unmute yourself. We don't have to do the hand thing.
okay, they seem to, in the Great Basin, we talk about the Great Basin like it's one homogeneous effect for cheatgrass, and they seem to be finding this elevation effect, which is maybe similar to what you're finding, where colder temperatures, higher elevations, they don't have the cheatgrass problem. It still tends to be more typical, I don't know, undisturbed vegetation. But if you get to lower elevations, that's where the cheatgrass is. So do you think maybe your sites are fitting in that higher elevation? I mean, you talked a bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. So Red Bluff, but then also in the Centennial Valley is a bit higher again. So those are areas that you would think would not get bad cheatgrass anyway. And in the Centennial Valley particularly, you really find it on the south facing slopes. So it's high elevation and it's only on the south facing slopes where it's warm enough. But you're totally right. If it's sagebrush and it's mountain sagebrush, that's likely to be much more resilient and resistant to cheatgrass than if you're down in the lower lands. So, I mean, I think that's why we've got low levels. We do have cheatgrass, but it's at low levels generally, in Montana, because we're slightly higher elevation. And then as soon as you do go up into higher areas, the climate isn't quite as conducive as it is in the valley bottoms. Any other questions? Stuart, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Lisa. I would just offer thanks for doing such a broad treatment of this topic. It's you and Jane and MSU have done some amazing work here to try to unravel this problem and to fill the toolbox up with viable alternatives. And it's difficult. I'm thankful more than loaded with questions.
Okay.
I have another question, Lisa. in southern Alberta, in fall seeded cereals, one of our agronomists have reported glyphosate resistant populations of downy brome or cheatgrass, but it's occurring in sort of agronomic settings. Are you seeing that in Montana? Are we concerned it's moving into rangelands? Are there biotype differences, do we think, or should we be worried about this?
That's an interesting question, and there's various groups that have tried to look at the biotype, and University of Washington, Ian, I'm forgetting his last name, he's actually looked at different biotypes, and he got people to send in samples from cropping areas in Washington, Idaho, and we send him stuff from Montana and then from rangelands. And it's not quite, well, when I saw him last, it wasn't quite finished. But he was finding different biotypes in the cropping area to the rangeland. I mean, obviously there's the potential that you could have seed spread by vehicles from one to the other. But at least his study was really suggesting at the moment it seems to be different biotypes. And because we haven't been spraying as much in rangelands as we do in cropping areas, I think just from that perspective, we're quite a long way behind with any luck. And it's a topic that's of interest, but not that easy to get too much support to look into. But as I said, there's that one study, and the results so far were hopeful that it's separate. Realize it's very dark in my room. I should turn the light on.
There's also a group out of Reno that's promoting, I think it's probably fairly high intensity fall grazing. Yeah. Do you have any comments on that? I assume your work was mostly on low to moderate grazing, or?
Oh, we did. You mean where we've got our sites are low grazing?
Yeah.
Yeah, they have been. And even the work in the Centennial where we try to do some targeted grazing, it's the same. It's all quite low levels of grazing. I mean, they're all on active ranches, but yeah, not super intense.
I mean, I always wonder what the mechanism was with their fall grazing. Was it seed removal or site modification, or?
I think the idea, yeah, the fall grazing is to reduce the biomass, but the few studies that I have seen, it only really works if you go back in the spring and do it again. I guess there's an admission from me. I was super into targeted grazing and I was very enthusiastic about it. And we've done a big study in the Centennial Valley, which I haven't talked about, and it hasn't really worked. And now I'm beginning to wonder why I was so enthusiastic about it in the first place. But I think the really intensive grazing is good if it can get some forage, but I don't really, it only works if you're going to graze strongly, in the fall and then the spring and keep doing it. So it manages to give forage and reduce the numbers, but I haven't seen much suggestion that you then get a good release of the other species that you would want. And maybe I'm just having an extra negative fit on targeted grazing because nothing's worked out in terms of the studies we've done so far, and maybe we've done it wrong. But, yeah. There's not much in the literature in terms of where it's really shown that apart from bringing down the cover, for the year or the 2 years after you graze, that it actually stays that way. So you've got to include a herbicide application or a seed amendment, I think, as well as doing the grazing. I think what it could also be useful for is if you have intensive targeted grazing and you're going to do some seed reintroduction, just because having the cattle moving around would be a good way to disturb the soil and actually get the seeds that you're putting on down into the soil. And I think in that case, it would be, you know, that would be another benefit. Does that answer your question properly?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think so. Thank you. They were just, I mean, the stuff I heard, it was as you had indicated, it was the savior of all rangelands. And it could be that they overstated their case from some early results, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found 2 studies that were recently, and they basically, I can't remember now, they had brought together all the studies that they could find on targeted grazing and basically looked to see where it had worked and how long it had worked for. And most studies don't last for very long, but what they did say was it could really only work for the year after grazing, and that only occurred in some places. So I think that's a little bit more where my negativity is coming from, if you use it as the only tool.
Could also be a case of desperation where they're turning cheatgrass into forage as opposed to returning to a natural state.
Right, and then and then if that's the case, then you've got to do that.
Yeah.
Well, I think that about wraps up our time this evening. So thanks, Lisa, for coming on and doing this webinar for us. This was really informative. And I think there's a lot more questions I have for you about management out at Red Bluff. And thanks everyone for joining this evening. This will be up on YouTube in a couple days. You can find the link on our website. See you next time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody.